Hello, welcome back to Couch Decoders. In this lesson, I'm going to go over subqueries and CTEs. We'll review what they are and how to use them. The first thing you might wonder is what are the differences and similarities between a CTE and subquery? I think CTEs are a little bit more straightforward, so we're going to start with that and then compare it to a subquery, a bit more straightforward. CTE stands for Common Table Expression. Every expression that you have is like a mini table that SQL saves inside its memory. So how it reads it is it starts from the top and then it goes down to the bottom. Very similar to how you would read an instruction manual or a book. Every individual CTE can be referenced many times. And we'll go over an example and I'll show you what I mean. CTEs are a little bit less common than subqueries. It's a newer feature that was added a couple years ago. So if you're inheriting any legacy code or if you're working with people who have a lot of experience in SQL, they might not use CTEs as often and they'll use a subquery. CTEs can also have subqueries inside of it. In comparison, let's look at a subquery. A subquery, instead of working from the top down, it works from the inside out. And that's what I think is kind of confusing about it because my brain doesn't work inside out. It works like top down in a linear fashion. The subquery can only be referenced one time. So your innermost query, that little inside nugget, it can only be referenced that one time. Subqueries are more common than CTEs, and subqueries can be nested as many times as you want. And I'll show you a nested subquery and what that looks like. So a nested subquery is just a query within a query within a query. So one subquery, your first subquery, that is a level 1 nested. And you can nest it 2, 3, 4, all the way as many times as you need. What subqueries and CTE share in common? They allow multiple queries within one statement. So you don't have to create a bunch of tables to do various manipulations. You can do it within all one huge query. And this is what we would call a complex query, something that isn't just a select star. You're doing some fancy footwork to it. Subqueries, CTEs are a must. Let's break down what a CTE looks like. So you always start a CTE using a with statement. You want to name your CTE something with meaning, something that makes sense. What you don't want to do is call it table 1, table 2, table 10. The next step is you write your query using the CTE in the from statement. So this is an example of code that uses a CTE. So we initialize our CTE, we get it started using the with statement. This is what we're going to call our little query. We're calling it labeled data. You have the as that's needed, and then you have the open parentheses and the close parentheses. And so this query right in here, where it says select star, and then we rename this column number as n name, this is what the computer is going to understand as labeled data. So this is the CTE. And then this is the next query. We're going to say select star from where? From labeled data. So you see this labeled data, it goes right here in the from statement. So what is the computer doing? First, it queries the labeled data and it saves it inside its memory bank. The data is ready to use, like I'm going to put in air quotes, a temporary table. If you are into SQL optimization and things like that, there's more that's going on in the background. But in terms of your learning, when you're first getting started, this is what you want to think of it as. Labeled data in this example is like a new little mini table. As soon as you're done with the query, labeled data goes away. But while I'm writing my query, I can use it just like a normal table. And so you have to end your CTE with a final query. What do I mean? I cannot just have with labeled data as this query and not do anything to it. I have to have just a regular select from something at the end, even if it's not related to labeled data. I have to have just a regular query in there. So what about multiple CTEs? So in this case, we see we have with labeled data, then we have a comma, top names, and then we have our final query at the bottom. So first, what happens is that the computer reads labeled data right at the top. Labeled data is used inside top names. So I get top names by selecting gender, year, name. I do a sum from where? From my labeled data. My labeled data is up here, okay? And then the last step is that we use top names down here at the bottom. So the final query uses top names. So this is how you would use a CTE. You start it with a with statement. You put any of your queries that you want in between. If you have multiple, you separate it with a comma. And then at the end, you just have any regular old query that you have. Okay, now that we've looked at it from a theoretical point of view, let's actually open up BigQuery and see what it looks like. Okay, so here I have, So here I have my code exactly as it was in the PowerPoint. If I run it just as it is now, it's going to run label data, then top names, then do my final query. When I'm building a CTE or trying to see what the code is doing, the first thing I do is I highlight this first part with labeled data and I hit Control Enter. I want to run it and see what's inside. I open it up and this is what my data looks like. I have state, gender, year, name, and I relabeled my number column as n_name. Great. The next thing I want to do is I want to see what does top names look like. Unfortunately, if I just highlight like I did before and hit run, I'm going to get an error. Why? Because it says table labeled data must be qualified with a data set. That's because when I highlight just this portion, the computer doesn't see the with statement and it doesn't know what labeled data is. If I want to see what's inside top names, I have to get a little fancier. So I'm just going to comment out, hit Control question mark. So now BigQuery is not going to read this part. And I'm going to do select star from top names. Why do I have to do that? If I just tried to run, let's just say I didn't do this and I just said, okay, I'm going to run label data, then top names, and I hit run. This is what it'll look like. Expected something or keyword select, but it got the end of the script. That's because whenever you have a CTE, you have to end it with a select statement. You can't just end it with a CTE in here. So now I'm going to redo this part. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to run the first query, labeled data, the second query, top names, and then we're going to see what is inside of top names, doing select star. Okay, so I open it up and I see I have gender, year, name, and then the sum of the names. So what this is telling me is that by gender and year, what was the most common name or the total number of name. For this final query, what we're going to do is we're just going to sum up these names by year. And I already have that here. Select year, sum n name as total from where? From top names and group by 1. And I'll just put a limit so I don't just use up all my data. And here we go. These are the total number of names by year. Let's go back into the PowerPoint and look at a subquery. How do we start a subquery? The first thing you want to do is write your initial query or your innermost query. But you just start with your first query. And this will be the inside of the subquery. So in our CT example, our innermost query would be labeled names. Then we write the quote shell of the outside query. So I always just start it the same way. Select star from. With the from, I do parentheses, parentheses, open parentheses, closed parentheses. And that's where I'm going to put my subquery. You put your initial query inside the parentheses. So that's where your initial query goes. So our labeled names would go inside these parentheses, and then we would do select star from that. So what is the computer doing? First, it reads the innermost query, labeled data, just like it would do with the CTE. That's our initial query. Then it reads the outer query, the select star from our base query. So how do we do a multi-nested subquery? So in this box to the right-hand corner, I have our order of operations. So if you're given a really complicated query and you're trying to figure out what this query does, I always follow these same marching orders. First, identify each query ranking. Find the innermost query and then work your way out. 2, run the inside query. Run that initial piece, see what the data looks like. Then go one level out. So I was in the most inside part, now I'm going to go one step out. Run that, see what it looks like. And then you keep repeating until you've gotten all the way to the end final query. And that's really the only way that you're going to be able to look at a query and really understand exactly what's going on, is if you can look at the data and see it. Someone might be really smart and they can just read it and know immediately, but if I'm not familiar with the data and I'm not familiar with the query, that's really how I always figure it out. So let's look at that. So this inner query, this is what would be in our CTE, the labeled data. So the next step is we go from our innermost query and we move up a level. So now we are in level 2. So this is level 1, the most inside query. This is level 2. What level 2 says is I want to take gender, year, name, sum up my column called n_name from where? From this data thing, whatever this happens to be. We know this as labeled data from our CTE, but that's what it is. This is the data that I'm pulling from, and then I want to group it by columns 1, 2, and 3. So if I was testing this, I would first run this query, check it, okay. Then I would run this query, check it, okay. Then we get to the big kahuna. This is the final query, and this starts with select year, sum, n_name as total from where? From this query 2, level 2. What does query 2 get its data from? From level 1. So that's why subqueries can become very complicated very quickly, because you're literally having to find the innermost part and then work your way backwards. And you are hoping and praying someone has good formatting so that you can easily see it and that they left some notes. So let's do a demo doing the same exact query we did with the CTE, but using a subquery. Okay, so here I have the same exact code that I had before in the PowerPoint. So if I run this inside part, okay, state, gender, year, name, and then my new column is called n_name. Great. If I run the second part, now I have the gender, year, name, and then the total of the name by year. And then this last part, I'm just going to sum the total name by each year. And for that, I can just hit Control Enter. Okay, so let's compare side by side the results using a CTE versus a subquery. So in this case, on this left panel, I use CTE, labeled data, top names, and then my final query. And what I got here was for year 1910, I had 516,312. Using the subquery that we just went through for 1910, I have the same exact number. So just looking at these side by side, these two queries are exactly the same. It's just a different way to present the data. In my opinion, using my data like this feels a lot easier for me. It's more of how my brain works. I know some people who really do love subqueries, so it really is kind of like a personal flavor. But that wraps up today's lesson. Drop a note if you had any questions or if you had any troubles, and I can try to help you offline. Bye. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I would be so appreciative if you could like the video and subscribe to help me create more content for you. Thank you.